The first time I realized my brother had come home to take something, I was standing in my parents' kitchen with a grocery bag cutting into my fingers and the smell of fresh coffee still in the room. My father was on the back porch. A man I had never seen before was in the yard with a clipboard, taking photographs of the house I had built for my parents' anniversary. My father looked at him and said, very politely, "Can I help you?" The man said he was there for an appraisal. My father turned and looked through the glass at me. He had one hand on the porch rail to steady himself. His face had gone blank in that quiet way people do when something is happening around them too fast and they are trying not to show it. I set the grocery bag down on the counter and walked outside. A little later, I would find a document folded in half with my father's name typed at the top and my brother's name in the line that mattered. But at that moment, all I had was a stranger in the yard, my father standing in his own backyard like a guest, and the feeling that I had missed something important. My name is Claire. I am 42 years old, and I work as a senior accountant for a regional manufacturing firm outside Traverse City, Michigan. I spend most of my days looking at numbers that other people skim past. Small transfers, rounding differences, dates that do not match. I do not think that skill came from school. I think it came from my father. He was the kind of man who believed the smallest details usually told the truth first. My father, Richard, worked in masonry for most of his life. He built fireplaces, porches, retaining walls, front steps. He had broad hands and a patient way of doing things. He never liked fuss. If something broke, he fixed it. If he could not fix it, he sat with it until he understood why. For most of my childhood, I thought there was nothing he could not carry. Then age started collecting its payment. His hips got bad first, then one knee, then his balance. After a mild heart episode 3 years ago, he never quite got his old stamina back. He could still move around, but stairs took too much out of him. Long hallways wore him down. Uneven ground made him slow in a way I could tell embarrassed him. He never said that part out loud. He did not need to. There was one afternoon at my parents' old house when I watched him pause halfway up the front steps with a paper bag of groceries in one hand. He was catching his breath, but he was trying to make it look like he had simply remembered something. My mother, Sharon, opened the door from inside and pretended not to notice. I pretended too. That was how our family handled hard things for years. Quietly, imperfectly, without naming them. My mother had been carrying more than any of us admitted. She handled his medications, appointments, meals, laundry, all of it, and she did it with the kind of silence people mistake for strength because it makes their own lives easier. One evening, I came by after work and found her standing at the sink with both hands pressed flat against the counter. The kitchen light was warm. Something with onions had been cooking. The dishwasher hummed. She had her eyes closed. When she heard me, she straightened and said, "Long day." I said, "You want me to finish dinner?" She smiled and said no too quickly. That was the night I started thinking seriously about building them a different house. I had money saved. Not enough for something foolish, but enough for something careful if I planned it right. I had been putting money aside for years without a real destination for it. I told myself it was for security. Then I watched my father avoid the stairs in his own house, and my mother lean on the sink like she had nothing left, and security started to look like a one-story floor plan. It took me nearly 2 years. I bought a small piece of land on a quiet lake about 40 minutes north of town. Not flashy, just water, trees, and enough level ground to do it properly. I met with a contractor and came in with a folder so organized he laughed once and then stopped laughing when he realized I was serious. I told him I wanted one floor only. Wide doorways. No steps at the entrance. Non-slip floors. A bathroom my father could use without needing my mother to stand outside the door worried he would fall. Lower counters in the kitchen so she would not have to work with her shoulders pulled tight all day. And a smooth path leading from the back porch to the dock. That path mattered to me more than anything else. My father grew up around water. His father had kept a small fishing boat, and some of my earliest memories are of sitting beside him at the end of a dock before the sun had fully come up. I can still remember the damp wood under my shoes and the cold smell of lake water in the air. He used to hand me the rod and say, "Easy now." You've got time. So I built him a place where time would not feel like an enemy. I gave them the house on their 40th anniversary. We drove up under the excuse of lunch. My father got out first. He looked at the porch, the low threshold, the long flat stretch of path behind the house, and he went very still. He walked through the front door slowly, one hand brushing the wall as he went. He looked into the bathroom, the kitchen, the bedroom. Then he opened the back door and walked out toward the water. I stayed where I was. He made it all the way to the dock on his own. For the first 6 months, it felt like I had given both of them a little bit of air back. Then my younger brother came home with a suitcase, a careful smile, and questions that did not sound dangerous until I heard enough of them in a row. Then I started paying attention. Then I waited. My brother's name, in this version of the story, is Daniel. He is 3 years younger than I am. When we were kids, he was the easy one to notice. He laughed louder, asked for more, took up space without meaning harm by it. I was the quieter child. The one who got good grades, remembered birthdays, washed dishes without being asked. My parents loved us both. I believe that. But families fall into habits, and ours had one I did not understand until much later. The person making noise gets seen first. Daniel moved to Ohio in his late 20s for work. Sales, then real estate, then something in logistics. The titles changed. The confidence did not. Over time, he became the kind of relative who called on holidays and sounded warm for 12 minutes at a time. I did not dislike him. We just stopped having a real place in each other's daily lives. So when my father called one Saturday morning and said, "Your brother is here," I knew from his voice that this was not a planned visit. I had stopped by a market in town for bread, apples, coffee beans my mother liked. I remember the paper bag on the passenger seat and the soft rattle of jars when I turned into their drive. There was a rental SUV parked beside my father's truck. Daniel's suitcase was already inside by the door. When I stepped into the house, he was standing in the living room in jeans and a quarter-zip sweater, smiling like he had only been gone a week. "Claire," he said. Thought I'd surprise everybody. My mother came out from the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel. She looked pleased, but also unsettled, the way people do when they are trying to catch up emotionally to something that has already entered the room. My father was in his chair by the window. He nodded once at me. That was enough. I understood he had not invited this. Daniel stayed through dinner, then through the weekend. By Monday, it was clear he had not come for a short visit. At first, nothing he said was openly wrong. That was part of what made it hard to name. He asked my father whether it was tiring to walk all the way down to the dock. He asked whether the shower bench felt stable. He asked my mother if keeping up a property this size was becoming a lot. The questions were soft, reasonable on the surface, but the shape of them bothered me. They all led in one direction. A few days after he arrived, I came over early before work and found my father sitting on the porch with his coffee, looking toward the water but not moving. Usually by then he would have made his slow walk halfway down the path at least. That morning he was still. I sat beside him and said, "You heading down later?" He took a sip from the heavy-bottomed mug I had bought him and said, "Maybe." He did not go. The next day Daniel joined him outside and said, in that bright, helpful tone some people use when they have already decided what your limits are, "Dad, I'll come with you." My father said nothing. Daniel took his elbow anyway. By the time they reached the dock, my father was no longer taking a walk. He was being managed through one. I watched from the kitchen window with my hand around a dish towel. The cotton was damp. The faucet was running. And I remember thinking that a person can lose something without any argument at all. Sometimes all it takes is another person insisting on helping long enough that the thing no longer feels like yours. After that, my father stopped going to the dock alone while Daniel was there. Then other details started to collect. One afternoon, Daniel left his laptop open on the dining table while he took a call outside. I was not snooping. I had come in with groceries and set them down near it. The screen was lit. At the top of the inbox was an email with final notice in the subject line. Underneath it, in the preview line, I could read the words "past due balance." I looked away immediately. Then I put the milk in the refrigerator and the bread in the bread box and said nothing. But a pattern had started. Daniel had become very interested in risk, in responsibility, in whether my parents had a plan. He asked if there were updated documents. He asked where paperwork was kept. He asked my mother whether she ever felt overwhelmed managing prescriptions and bills. He asked my father if he had considered what would happen if something sudden came up. He said all of it like a concerned son. Still, there was an urgency underneath that concern. A timing issue. The kind you only hear when you spend your life around numbers and know how panic hides inside neat columns. The first real crack came at dinner in the third week. My mother had made roast chicken. The windows were open a little. I could hear insects outside and the small tap of my father's fork against the plate. Halfway through the meal, Daniel set a manila folder on the table between the salt and the butter dish. He said I was doing some research. No one answered. He opened the folder and slid a few printed pages forward. Assisted living brochures, cost comparisons, a list of places near Columbus where he lived. He kept his voice calm. I'm not saying now. I'm just saying it would be smart to think ahead. My father looked down at the papers for about 3 seconds. Then he picked them up, stood slowly, walked to the kitchen drawer where my mother kept spare menus and appliance manuals, and placed the whole stack inside without a word. His hand shook when he closed the drawer. Daniel went quiet after that, but not because he had changed direction. Only because he had understood the direct route was not going to work. That night, after my mother had gone to bed, my father came out to the porch where I was sitting with a blanket over my knees. He had a single folded sheet of paper in his hand. He gave it to me without speaking. I opened it under the porch light. It was a power of attorney form. My father's full legal name was typed where it should have been. Daniel's name was typed on the line naming the agent. The signature line at the bottom was still blank. I looked up at my father. He said, very quietly, he brought me a pen. I did not answer right away. I just folded the paper once, then again, and set it in my lap. Then I waited. I sat with that document in my lap for a long time before I said anything. The porch light was on. I could hear the water moving softly against the dock. My father had both hands resting on the arms of his chair, not gripping them hard, just holding himself steady. He looked older in that moment than he had a month earlier, and not because of his body. Because of the insult. I asked him, when did he give you this? This afternoon, he said. Your mother was in the shower. I nodded once. He kept looking out toward the dark water. He said it was just in case. Said I should sign while we were both thinking clearly. That sentence stayed with me, not the words themselves. The construction of it. We were both thinking clearly. It was a small verbal trick, the kind that tries to turn agreement into proof before anyone has actually agreed to anything. I heard the calculation in it immediately. I asked, did he explain why it needed to be him? My father gave a tired half shrug. Said he lived closer to better care. Said you already had enough on your plate. Said he knew how to handle things. I looked down at the paper again. It had been downloaded from somewhere online. Generic form. Blank witness lines. Nothing had been filed. Nothing had legal force yet. That mattered. In my line of work, panic makes people sloppy. They assume that because an idea has been printed, it has become real. Most of the time, it has not. Most of the time, reality is slower than that. It has steps. I turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. Then I said, okay. My father looked at me, waiting. I said, we handle this in order. He did not speak. He just listened. First, this does not get signed. He nodded. Second, tomorrow I'm checking the property records and confirming exactly what is in your name, Mom's name, and nobody else's. Another nod. Third, I'm finding out whether he has contacted anyone else. Realtor, lawyer, lender, anyone. My father let out a breath through his nose. Not relief exactly, but something near it. I folded the form one more time and put it in my bag. And until I know more, you don't discuss documents with him alone. He looked at the water again and said, I don't like this. I know, I said. After a minute, he said, I don't want a war in the house. I said, then we won't have one. That was the point when I stopped feeling confused and started feeling organized. The next morning, before work, I sat at my own kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it. Coffee on one side, pen on the other. The way I always set things up when something matters and I need to see it clearly. I made a list. Property deed, tax mailing address, insurance contact, utility account names, any recent title inquiry, any broker or appraisal contact. Then I started checking what I could access without calling anyone. The deed was exactly what I expected. The lake house was in my parents' names. No transfer. No lien beyond the original construction financing, which had already been paid off. The tax bills were going to the house directly. Insurance was current. Utilities were normal. No signs, at least on paper, that Daniel had managed to insert himself anywhere official. That was good, but it did not explain the pressure. People who are casually curious do not bring printed power of attorney forms to dinner table families. People who order appraisals without asking are not just exploring possibilities. They are trying to create momentum. At lunch, I stepped outside my office and made 2 calls from the parking lot. The first was to the county office, just to verify there had been no recent filing activity tied to the parcel. There had not. The second was to a local real estate contact I knew through a client. I asked carefully whether an appraisal could be ordered by someone other than the property owner. He said, sure. Anybody can hire one for an opinion of value. Doesn't mean they can sell the place. That mattered too. It meant Daniel had not gained control. He had only been gathering numbers. I drove out to the house after work. The late sun was coming through the trees, thin and gold. My mother was in the kitchen chopping herbs, and I could smell rosemary before I even set my bag down. My father was on the porch, cup in hand. Daniel was in the living room with his shoes off, one ankle on the opposite knee, looking comfortable in a way that irritated me on sight. I did not speak to him first. I walked into the kitchen and asked my mother, has anyone else been here? Anyone calling? Lawyer, realtor, banker, anybody like that. She looked up at me surprised. No. Why? Just asking. She held my gaze for a second too long. She knew better than to believe that was casual, but she also knew me well enough not to press when I was still sorting pieces. A little later, Daniel came in and opened the refrigerator. He said, without turning, "You're here a lot." I was standing at the counter slicing bread. Yes. He took out a bottle of water. I'm not criticizing, just noticing. I set the knife down. You've been here 3 weeks. He smiled slightly. And I know the difference between concern and inventory. That got his attention. He shut the refrigerator door and leaned back against it. You think I'm inventorying our parents? I kept my voice level. I think you're asking a lot of procedural questions for someone who says he only came to visit. He gave a soft laugh. You always did make everything sound criminal. No, I said. Only the things that arrive in a folder. That smile disappeared. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. My mother was in the next room. I could hear my father's chair shift on the porch. The house had gotten very still. Daniel said, "Somebody has to be practical." I picked up the bread and moved it to a plate. Practical would have been asking what the house was designed for before suggesting they leave it. He folded his arms. Claire, come on. Look at Dad. This setup works now, maybe. But what about next year? Or the year after that? There are costs. There's liability. There are better options. Better for whom? He did not answer that directly. Instead, he said, "You made yourself indispensable here." That was the first honest thing he had said. I looked at him and saw, very clearly, what had been underneath everything since he arrived. Not just money. Not just debt. Something messier. Resentment with numbers attached to it. He had come home and found a house built with care, systems in place, routines already formed, and no space where he could naturally become central. So he had tried to create one. I said, "You are not being shut out. You are just late." He stared at me for a moment, then looked away. That evening, after dinner, I walked my father's coffee mug to the sink and noticed a business card on the counter near the fruit bowl. Heavy cream cardstock. Local appraisal company. A cell number written on the back in blue ink. I picked it up and turned it over once. Then I slipped it into my pocket and said nothing. Later that night, sitting in my car at the end of the drive with the interior light off, I called the number on the back. A man answered on the second ring. I gave him my name and the property address. I told him I was trying to understand who had authorized his visit. He hesitated, then said, "A family member named Daniel requested a market valuation." He said he was helping his parents prepare for a possible transition. Possible transition. I thanked him, wrote the phrase down on the legal pad I kept in my bag, and ended the call. When I looked up, the porch light was still on. And, through the front window, I could see Daniel standing alone in the kitchen with his phone in his hand, as if he was waiting for something that had not happened yet. Then I drove home. The next morning, I did not go to work right away. I called in and took a personal day. Then I sat at my kitchen table with the appraisal company's card, my legal pad, and the unsigned power of attorney form laid out side by side. Outside, a delivery truck backed up somewhere down the street. My kettle clicked off. The room smelled faintly like toast I had forgotten in the toaster and never wanted. I looked at the 3 items for a long time, not because I was unsure what they meant, because I wanted to be precise about what they did not mean. The appraisal did not give Daniel any authority. The form did not give him any authority. The brochures did not give him any authority. But each one was a small attempt to move my parents out of the center of their own lives and turn them into a problem to be solved by somebody else. That was the real issue, and it was already happening inside the house whether anything had been signed or filed or sold. So I made another list. Step 1, protect the documents. Step 2, remove the surprise. Step 3, put neutral people between Daniel and anything official. That was the whole plan. Nothing dramatic. Just structure. I drove out to the lake before 9. The morning was cool. There was mist still hanging low over the water in thin strips, and the gravel at the side of the driveway looked darker from the dew. My father was already awake, sitting on the porch with his mug in both hands. My mother was inside, folding towels at the dining table. Daniel's rental car was gone. That helped. I sat beside my father and said, "He go somewhere?" My father nodded. "Into town." I asked, "Did he say where?" No, that was fine. I did not need where yet. I only needed a window. I went inside and asked my mother for a plain manila envelope and a rubber band. She gave both to me without asking why. Then I took every relevant paper I could find with their permission and laid them out on the dining table. Deed copy, insurance declaration page, utility statements, tax notice, my father's current will, my mother's, the construction file I had kept for them in a labeled accordion folder after the house was finished. I did not remove anything original from the home. I just sorted it, copied what needed copying, and created order where there had only been a stack. My mother watched me for a while, then said, "Is this about Daniel?" I said yes. She sat down slowly across from me. I thought maybe he was just worried. I kept my tone gentle. He may be worried, but he is also trying to get ahead of decisions that are not his to make. She looked down at the documents. Her fingers rested on the edge of the tablecloth. "Your father hates paperwork." I know. He'll sign things just to stop looking at them. That was one of the most useful things she could have told me. I wrote it down. Not because I did not understand it already, but because the clearest truths are the ones you can say plainly enough to put on paper. Your father hates paperwork. He'll sign things just to stop looking at them. That was not incompetence. That was a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities need systems around them. I made copies of the power of attorney form and slid the original into the envelope with the appraisal card and a page of notes. Then I asked my father if he would come into town with me after lunch. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Where?" "To see someone neutral." He understood immediately that I was not asking for permission to take over. I was asking him to step back into the middle of things himself. He said, "All right." By noon, Daniel still had not returned. That made me more certain he was working some angle, though I did not yet know which one. I packed my father's paperwork into my tote, made sure my mother had my cell number written on a notepad by the refrigerator, even though she already knew it by heart, and then I drove my father into town. There was an attorney in the county seat named Harold Bennett. Older man. Estate planning, land transfers, probate, that kind of work. He had known my father in passing years ago through a contractor dispute where, as far as I remembered, Harold had been the only person in the room who spoke without trying to sound important. I trusted that type. His office was above a hardware store on the main street. We climbed the short set of stairs slowly, my father using the handrail, me a half step behind without touching him. The receptionist offered him water. He declined. We sat in 2 brown chairs by the window until Harold came out himself in shirt sleeves and called my father by his first name. That helped too. Inside the office, I laid everything out in order. The unsigned form, the appraisal card, my notes. Then I said as little as possible. Harold read in silence. Once he looked over his glasses at my father and asked, "Did you sign anything?" My father said, "No. Did you tell your son he could act on your behalf?" "No." "Did you ask him to arrange an appraisal?" "No." Harold nodded once and leaned back. Then he said something I had needed my father to hear from a third party. He said, "Nothing here has legal effect unless you choose to give it legal effect." My father sat very still when he heard that. I do not think he had realized how much ground he had already surrendered in his own mind. Harold went on. He explained, calmly and without any drama, that an unsigned power of attorney was just paper. An appraisal commissioned by a son did not authorize a sale. No one could transfer property or make placement decisions because they had printed a form from the internet and walked around asking worried questions in a low voice. If my father wanted, Harold said, they could put fresh documents in place now. Clear ones. Updated ones. With safeguards. My father looked at me, then back at him. What kind of safeguards? Harold folded his hands on the desk. You can name no agent at all for now. Or one later. Or require a physician's written finding before any power takes effect. You can require accounting. You can restrict real estate transactions. You can revoke old language. The point is that you decide, not whoever arrives first with the printer. That was the moment something changed in my father's face. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. The version of him that had framed houses and poured footings and fixed engines late at night when everyone else had gone to bed was still there. He had just been spoken around for 3 weeks, and that kind of thing can make a man feel absent from his own life if it goes on long enough. He asked a few more questions. Good ones. Focused ones. Then he said he wanted new documents drawn, not because he was ready to hand anyone control, but because he wanted the boundaries written clearly while he was still fully himself. Harold nodded and started a file. When we came back down the stairs, my father moved a little slower than before, but he was standing straighter. We stopped at a diner on the way back. He ordered soup and half a sandwich. I ordered coffee I did not need. The place smelled like bacon grease and lemon cleaner, and the waitress knew him by name from years back. Halfway through the meal, he said, "I don't want your mother scared." I said, "Then we give her facts." He tore a cracker packet open carefully. "And your brother?" I stirred my coffee and watched the spoon make one quiet circle. We stopped letting him operate in private. He nodded once. That was enough. When we got back to the house, Daniel's car was in the driveway. He was standing in the kitchen when we walked in, one hand flat on the counter, his phone beside him. He looked from me to my father, and then to the folder in my tote bag. He said, "Where have you two been?" My father set his keys down in the ceramic bowl by the door and answered before I could. "Taking care of my own business." Daniel's face changed very slightly when he heard that. Just enough. Then he smiled, but it came late. I was only trying to help. I took my coat off, folded it over the back of a chair, and said, "Good. Then you won't mind if everything goes through counsel from now on." He looked at me for a second too long. And then he said, "Counsel for what exactly?" I did not answer him there. I waited for dinner. Dinner was quiet at first. My mother made baked cod with rice and green beans. The window above the sink was cracked open a few inches, and the evening air coming in smelled like wet leaves and lake water. My father sat at the head of the table. Daniel was across from me. I noticed he kept checking his phone screen whenever it lit up, then turning it face down again. I waited until everyone had started eating. Then I set my fork down and said, "Dad and I met with Harold Bennett this afternoon." Daniel looked up immediately. "Why?" My father answered in the same calm tone he had used at the door. "Because I wanted legal advice." There was a small pause after that. Not dramatic. Just enough for the room to rearrange itself. Daniel said, about what? I reached into my tote and took out the manila envelope. I pulled out the unsigned power of attorney form first and laid it on the table. Then I placed the appraisal card beside it. About these, I said. My mother looked from the form to Daniel and then to my father. Her face changed slowly, like someone reading a sign from far away and only then realizing what it says. Daniel did not touch either paper. I already told you. The form was just a precaution. My father picked up his napkin, folded it once, and set it back in his lap. A precaution for whom? Daniel opened his mouth and then closed it. I kept my voice even. Let's keep this simple. You arranged an appraisal without asking the owners of the property. You presented Dad with a legal form naming yourself as agent. You brought assisted living materials into the house without either of them asking for them. Those are not random acts. That is a sequence. He turned to me. You always do this. You line everything up like it's a prosecution. No, I said. I line things up so nobody can pretend they happened by accident. My mother looked at Daniel now, not confused anymore, just hurt. Did you really bring your father paperwork to sign when I wasn't in the room? Daniel rubbed one hand over his mouth. Mom, I was trying to think ahead. My father said, you were trying to get ahead. The room went still. It was not loud. That is what I remember most. There was no shouting, no slammed hands, no big speech. Just one true sentence laid in the middle of the table where no one could move around it. Daniel looked at my father and said, You think I'm trying to steal from you? My father answered with more dignity than anger. I think you are treating me like a decision to be processed. Daniel looked down, then back at me. And you're not. That was the question he had been carrying from the beginning. Not whether he was right, whether I could be made to look the same. I said no. He gave a short, unbelieving laugh. Come on, Claire. You built the house. You manage their bills. You keep the records. You're here all the time. You think that's not control. I let that sit for a second before I answered. Then I said if I wanted control, I would have built a place that made them dependent on me. I did the opposite. I built a place where Dad could move without asking permission. A place where Mom could stop holding the whole house up by herself. I put options into the structure. You brought limits in a folder. My father's eyes stayed on Daniel, not on me. Daniel said, quieter now, I needed help. There it was. Not an excuse exactly, just the first clean fact. I did not soften my tone, but I did not harden it either. I know. He looked at me like he had expected argument and did not know what to do without it. I said, your inbox was showing final notices. You ordered a valuation on a house you do not own. You started talking about transitions before you asked whether our parents wanted anything changed. You needed something. I understand that. But needing something does not create a right to take position inside someone else's life. My mother closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet. Daniel said, I wasn't trying to throw them out. I believe that, at least in the most literal sense. He was not trying to drag them anywhere. He was trying to move the center of authority toward himself and let the rest follow naturally after that. So I said, you were trying to become the one through whom everything had to pass. That is close enough. My father lifted one hand slightly from the table. A small motion, but it stopped the room. Then he spoke directly to Daniel. I am still here. Daniel stared at him. My father went on. I am sick sometimes. I get tired. I move slower than I used to. None of that means I stopped existing in my own house. Daniel dropped his eyes. My father's voice never rose. You don't arrange things around me and call it help. The only sound for a few seconds was the soft tick of the kitchen clock. My mother put her napkin beside her plate and said, very quietly, why didn't you just tell us if you were in trouble? Daniel did not answer right away. He looked embarrassed now, not defensive. There is a difference. Defensive people look outward. Embarrassed people start collapsing inward. Finally, he said, because I knew how it would sound. I said, worse than this. He did not answer that. I took one sheet from the envelope and placed it on the table. It was not a threat, just a fact written clearly. Harold's office had prepared a short acknowledgement for my father to review, stating that no one had authority to act for him, market the property, or initiate transfer discussions without his direct written instruction. Temporary, plain, useful. I said, from now on, any legal or property issue goes through Dad, and if he wants counsel, through Harold. No side paperwork. No calls made on assumption. No visits arranged without consent. That is the structure. Daniel looked at the page but did not reach for it. He said, "So that's it? You just lock me out." My father answered before I could. "No, I set terms." That sentence landed harder than anything else that night. Because it was not about me winning an argument with my brother. It was about my father stepping back into authorship over his own life while both his children sat there and watched him do it. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked toward the dark window over the sink. His face had gone flat in that tired way people get when the version of the story they were telling themselves no longer holds. After a while he said, "I thought nobody would do anything if I asked directly." My mother looked at him. "Then that should have told you the answer." He nodded once. Barely. No one spoke for a little while after that. My father finished half his fish and pushed the plate away. My mother stood and carried dishes to the sink, though I could tell she was doing it mostly to have something steady to touch. I gathered the papers back into the envelope one by one. Daniel stayed seated. Then, after a long silence, he said, "I'll leave in the morning." My father said, "All right." No one tried to stop him. Later that night, after my parents had gone to bed, I stepped out onto the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The air had turned colder. The porch light cast a pale circle over the top of the steps. Down at the dock, the bench was only a shape against the dark water. After a minute, the front door opened behind me. Daniel came out and stood a few feet away, not close enough to make this feel intimate, not far enough to pretend it was casual. He said, "You really think I came here to take everything?" I kept my eyes on the water. "I think you came here desperate enough to tell yourself a cleaner story than the one you were actually living." He was quiet. Then he said, "That sounds like something you wrote down." "It sounds like something I noticed." He let out a breath. "I don't know when I became this person." I pulled the blanket tighter at my shoulders. It usually happens slowly. He did not say anything after that. We stood there for maybe a minute more, listening to the water move below the dock. Then he went back inside, and I stayed where I was until the porch light clicked against a moth circling near the glass, and the whole house finally went still. Daniel left just after sunrise. I was already awake when I heard his suitcase wheels crossing the porch boards. I did not go to the door. Neither did my father. My mother stood at the kitchen window with her hand around a mug and watched his rental car back down the drive between the trees. When the sound of it was gone, the house felt larger and quieter at the same time. My father was sitting at the table when I came in. He had not taken his coffee outside yet. He said, "I don't want this to turn into something ugly." I sat across from him. The table still smelled faintly of lemon oil from where my mother had wiped it down the night before. I said, "Then it won't." He looked at me for a second and nodded. That was enough. He knew I was not going to chase Daniel, and I was not going to let the last few weeks be rewritten into a misunderstanding either. Both things could be true at once. That morning I drove back into town and stopped at Harold Bennett's office again. We kept everything simple. My father signed updated documents that did 3 things clearly and without drama. First, they revoked any prior informal assumptions anyone might try to rely on. Second, they stated that no power of attorney would take effect unless specific conditions were met and verified properly. Third, they placed clear restrictions around any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the lake house without direct written consent while my father was competent, which Harold documented he plainly was. There was nothing theatrical about any of it. Just signatures, witnesses, dates, copies. That is what resolution usually looks like in real life. A clean file, a quiet office, a person in a button-down shirt initialing the bottom corner of a page so no one else can later pretend the corner was blank. Harold also recommended one more practical step. He suggested my parents keep a short written notice in their home file stating that no third party was authorized to discuss sale, placement, or transfer matters on their behalf unless my parents said so directly. Not because that paper had magical power, but because clear paper changes the tone of future conversations. It tells outsiders they are walking into structure, not confusion. I brought the copies back that afternoon in a labeled folder. My mother put it in the hall cabinet beside the extra batteries, the warranty manuals, and the flashlight. She said, "I know where that is." I believed her. My father took his cup outside after lunch and sat on the porch looking toward the dock. He still did not walk down that day. I did not mention it. I made sandwiches, rinsed dishes, checked the thermostat, and left before dinner. I understood something by then that I had not fully understood when I built the place. Independence is not restored by insisting on it. Sometimes the best thing you can do is create conditions and then step back far enough that the person can find his own way back into them. So that is what I did. For the next 3 mornings, I came by early with groceries or coffee or some ordinary excuse that did not ask anything of him. My mother and I talked in the kitchen in low voices. My father sat on the porch with his wide mug in both hands and watched the water. Some mornings he looked stronger. Some mornings he looked tired. But he was thinking, and I knew better than to interrupt thought when it is doing important work. On the 4th morning, he asked me a question. We were sitting on the porch. It was cold enough that I had my hands tucked into my sleeves. The lake was still, and there was a thin silver line of light just starting to gather over it. He said, "Claire, tell me the truth." I said, "I will." He kept his eyes on the water. "Did you build this place for me, or did you build it so you could take care of me your way?" I had known, somewhere in the back of my mind, that the question was coming. Daniel had not only threatened the house. He had contaminated the meaning of help. He had taken words like safety and planning and made them sound like cages. My father needed to know whether I was using softer tools for the same purpose. So I answered carefully. I said if I wanted control, I would have built railings everywhere whether you wanted them or not. I would have hired someone to stay here full-time. I would have put systems in place that made every choice pass through me. I didn't do that. I built a house where you could still reach your own door, your own shower, your own porch, your own dock. He was quiet. I went on. I did not build this to shrink your life. I built it to stop your life from shrinking faster than it had to. That was the truest sentence I had. He sat with it for a while. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and set his cup down on the small table beside his chair. A minute later, he stood up. He steadied himself with one hand on the armrest. Then he looked out toward the dock and started walking. I stayed on the porch. Not because I was detached. Because that walk did not belong to me. He moved slowly, but with purpose. Down the porch steps without difficulty, because there were none. Along the flat path. Past the place where the grass changed near the shore, out onto the dock boards that had silvered a little from weather. He did not rush. He did not look back. When he got to the bench, he sat down and lifted the cup again with both hands. My mother came to stand beside me. She had not said a word while he walked. Neither had I. Then she touched my arm and whispered, "He went on his own." I said yes. She started to cry a little. Not in a breaking way. In the quiet way people cry when something tense inside them finally loosens. That was the rail resolution, more than any document in Harold's file. But the paperwork mattered too, and it kept mattering. About 2 weeks later, Harold called to confirm all signed originals were stored and copies had been delivered. He also mentioned, casually, that my father had asked to update his will while everything was in motion. Harold did not volunteer details at first, and I did not ask. Those were my father's decisions. Later that same week, my father told me himself. We were sitting on the porch in a late afternoon. My mother had gone inside to start supper. The porch light had not come on yet, but the sky had that softened look it gets before evening settles properly. He said, "I changed the will." I waited. He said, "The house passes to you." I started to tell him he did not need to do that. He lifted his fingers a little, and I stopped. Then he said, very plainly, "I'm not doing it because I'm angry at your brother. I'm doing it because I want the house to stay with the person who understood what it was for." There was no arguing with that. Not because I wanted the house, but because this was not really about property anymore. It was about authorship. He was drawing a line in ink and saying, "This was my life, and I knew who protected it without trying to run it." I looked out at the dock for a second before I answered. Then I said, "All right." He put his hand over mine for a moment. His skin felt cool and dry. He said, "You noticed." That was all. A few days after that, Daniel called me. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I answered. He was quiet for the first few seconds. Then he asked how Dad was. I said, walking to the dock again. He said, "Good." There was a pause. Then he said, "I shouldn't have arranged the appraisal." I said, "No," another pause. He did not ask about the documents. He did not ask about the will. I do not know whether he sensed those things had already moved beyond his reach or whether he simply understood that the opening for manipulation was gone. Maybe both. Finally, he said, I was upside down. Financially. I know. I told myself I was thinking ahead. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my kitchen. That may even have been partly true. He gave a dry little laugh. That sounds like you. It should. He was quiet again, then said, "Tell Dad I said hello." I said I would. I did tell him. My father nodded and did not comment. That was his boundary. Not warm. Not cruel. Just exact. From then on, the consequences were simple and realistic. Daniel stopped making decisions from inside the house because he no longer could. My parents' documents were clear. Their property was protected. Conversations about care, if they happened in the future, would happen with my father in the center of them, not at the edge. No one had to be punished publicly. No speech had to be made. The structure itself did the work. And once the structure was in place, peace started to return. After that, life became ordinary again in the way I had hoped it might. Not perfect, just orderly. I started stopping by the lake house every few days instead of every day. Sometimes I brought groceries. Sometimes a fresh loaf of bread from the bakery in town. Sometimes nothing at all except an hour to sit on the porch and let the quiet do what quiet is supposed to do. My mother began sleeping better. You could see it in small ways first. The tightness around her mouth eased. She stopped bracing one hand against the counter when she stood still. She put basil and thyme in pots near the kitchen window and started clipping from them while she cooked. One evening, I came in and heard her humming under her breath while she sliced tomatoes. It took me a second to place the sound because I had not heard it in so long. My father settled back into his routines. Coffee first, then the porch. Then, when he felt ready, the walk to the dock. Some mornings he made it all the way to the bench. Some mornings he only went halfway down the path and stood there looking at the water. The important part was that no one interpreted that for him. No one announced what it meant. No one rushed in to help him perform either strength or decline. He was allowed to be exactly what he was that day, and I think that freedom mattered as much as the house itself. The porch light came on every evening again. He still liked to turn it on himself. One night near the end of summer, I came by with a paper bag of groceries on one arm and a thermos of coffee in the other hand. My mother took the groceries inside. My father was already on the porch, looking out over the lake. The water was flat and gray-blue, and there was a heron standing near the reeds at the edge of the shore. I sat beside him and poured coffee into the lid cup from the thermos. After a while, he handed me a folded note. His handwriting had grown less steady over the last few years, so I read it carefully. It said, "You didn't manage me. You made room." I folded it again and put it in my wallet. It is still there. A month later, my mother said something to me that stayed just as deeply. We were standing in the kitchen after dinner, drying dishes. The window was open a crack. I could hear crickets outside and the soft clink of plates as I stacked them. She said, "Your brother got noticed when he needed things. You stayed quiet, so I kept thinking you were fine." I did not answer right away. Then she said, "Quiet and fine are not the same." I set the dish towel down and looked at her. She had tears in her eyes, but she was not asking me to rescue her from them. She was simply telling the truth plainly, the way people sometimes can only do after a hard season has cleared. I told her she did not need to carry all of that alone. She said maybe not, but she still wanted to say it. So I let her. That was another thing I learned in all this. Sometimes repair is not a grand gesture. Sometimes it is just letting a true sentence land without hurrying to make everyone comfortable again. Daniel and I speak now, though not often. He called once in the fall and asked how our father was doing. I told him the truth. Some days better than others. Still making the walk. Still turning on the porch light. Still himself. Daniel said he was glad to hear it. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No perfect apology. Real life usually does not hand those out in complete forms. What it did offer was something smaller and more believable. He stopped trying to insert himself into decisions that were not his. He stayed in his lane. He understood, I think, that concern without respect becomes control very quickly, and that he had crossed that line. That was enough for now. As for me, I went back to my own routines too. Work, laundry, bills, Saturday mornings with groceries in the trunk. The kind of life that looks uneventful from the outside and feels deeply earned on the inside. Some nights I still sit at my kitchen table with tea after everything is done and think about how close my father came to feeling like a guest in the one place designed to give him back a sense of ownership over his own body, his own pace, his own days. And I think about how often this kind of thing happens quietly. Not always around a lake house. Not always with legal forms and appraisals. Sometimes it is a son. Sometimes a daughter. Sometimes a neighbor who starts helping too much. Sometimes a person in a family becomes the loudest voice in the room, and everyone else slowly shifts around that noise until the person most affected almost disappears inside it. That is the part people should pay attention to. Not only the paperwork, the drift. The way a person can be spoken around little by little until someone patient enough finally says, no, put him back in the center. A few evenings ago, I drove out just before sunset. My mother was slicing bread. My father was already down at the dock. I could see him from the porch, sitting on the bench with his cup beside him, looking out at the water like he had nowhere else he needed to be. I stood there for a minute and did not call out. The trees were still. The light was soft. The house behind me was quiet in the right way. And I remember thinking that in the end, I had not really given my parents a house. I had given them a place where choice could stay visible, where care did not have to feel like surrender, where my father could still walk, slowly and with shaking hands, toward something that was his because he had decided to go there. If you stayed with me through this, thank you. Please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. 2 popular stories will be waiting for you next, and I think both of them will stay with you in the same quiet way.